Hello, Mark Sheeky here. I thought I'd talk a little bit about my album, The Myth of Sisyphus, which I've recently re-recorded for a 2026 release. The album was originally written in 2020, the year of COVID, for a 2021 release. I first started writing music in the early 1990s on Amiga, on Pro Tracker, primarily inspired by and for the PD games that I used to write. Probably by about the year 2000 or so, I'd started to record album-length works of material. My first album was Archangel for the game I was writing on PC at the same time. That was my first PC game. In fact, it was nearly my first PC program. But most of the early music, my first 10 or 15 albums or so, was entirely instrumental electronic music, inspired by Jean-Michel Jarre and Commodore 64 8-bit music, which was a huge influence on my earlier music. But perhaps when I started painting, around about 2004 was my first painting, but it was probably 7 when I started taking it more seriously. I began to explore a lot more different types of art and doing different things in performance, and it gradually led to wanting to do more vocal music and more expressive forms of live music, totally in contrast to the electronic music I'd written. The first album of songs I recorded was The Modern Game in 2018. I had done an experimental recording album before then called what was it called? It was called Fear of the Thing Itself by the Harlequin Kings. But that was very much a learning process, as all the albums that I started on are. Part of my philosophy is that you learn by doing. That I applied that to my painting too. You just have to get out there and do something, knowing that eventually you'll surpass it and then have to go back and improve it. And that's part of the reason I've re-recorded The Myth of Sisyphus. When I recorded it the first time, I knew it was an experimental work that I would improve upon and then polish up, finish to a final best version, which is what this re-recording represents, I guess. The Myth of Sisyphus itself as an album is about Sisyphus, the Greek mythological character who must roll a heavy boulder up a hill, only to watch it roll down every evening, and so for eternity perform a thankless task, which is something that Albert Camus, the philosopher and French Algerian writer, wrote about in his book, The Myth of Sisyphus. This album isn't directly inspired by the Camus book, but I've included a nod to that with the last track, The Problem of Suicide, as Camus' philosophy is all about the choices of life are between meaninglessness and suicide, or how to find meaning in a meaningless life by doing a thankless task. Hence, Sisyphus becomes a hero. But for me, this album itself is more of a journey of Sisyphus that rolls not up a hill and down again, but along a track, eternally finding something that might be better around the next corner. Stoic, but also hopeful. So the album itself is different from Camus' philosophy and different from the Greek philosophy. It's a concept album in the style of Pink Floyd, approximately. The whole album is cyclic. The last track ends where the first track begins, rather like Pink Floyd's The Wall. So the album does have a Pink Floyd sort of feeling to it. It was my first album to include live guitars. Up until that point, I'd recorded synth guitars. The previous album, Burn of God, used some synth guitars on, which I thought sounded fine at the time, but of course as soon as I started to learn to play live guitars and add them, I thought I can do better. So eventually re-recorded Burn of God 2. I'll probably even have another go at that at one point. It's part of my remaster process to revisit albums 5 or 10 years later to make them the versions they always could have been, because, as I said, much of what I'm doing is experimental and learning as I go along. I think that's part of being an artist, to make something better and better. An artist should always be making new things and always be making existing things better. Other tracks on the album include an homage to the folk singer Nick Drake. That particular track uses a monotone main lead. There's practically the idea behind it was that in each major and minor triad, 3 notes each, there are 6 notes. So if you pick any particular note on the chromatic scale, for example G, there are 6 chords that involve a G, and I wanted to write a song that kept the same monotone melody while using all of those 6 chords. So that's what Nick Drake does. I'm sure you can listen out for that one. And there are a few other tracks on there. There's I Care, which is a punky sort of song about caring about something when nobody else does, which is a Sisyphean theme in itself. That was written for my radio show Arts Lab originally, but it seems perfect for this album. So I re-recorded it for this album. And there's a few slightly older tracks. The Invisible Man, which is also about feeling invisible in a visible world. So it directly links to I Care, I suppose. And another track called Light Blue Evening. And both The Invisible Man and Light Blue Evening were written probably 6 or 7 years before that, before 2020, for that Harlequin Kings album, but they were written for a Facebook game, which is beyond the scope of this little chat. But it shows that those 2 songs are slightly older than the others, but they do fit in exactly with the theme. I like to link all the tracks musically as well as thematically. This is very much a concept album. I've tended to move between albums that are just collections of songs, random songs, often surrealistic and imaginative, like my paintings, and albums that are unified with a specific theme and a concept, but also have musical elements that interplay from one track to another track to another track to give a sort of symphonic feel. And so I've done that with this too. You could probably pick out various bits and various links between tracks. I like an album to feel like a whole album, not a collection of individual tracks. I guess in that respect it's a completely anachronistic to appear in 2026 really. Even in 2020 it was anachronistic, but I'm here to make the best art I can. I don't care what the market says about it really. That's not too important. You have to do, as an artist, you have to do what you think is best really, I suppose. In terms of production, the album was entirely put together using my software, the software I've developed called Prometheus. I've never used a DAW by somebody else. I've never used third-party plugins. All of the plugins, all of the software I use to make my music and my DAW in effect is my software called Prometheus, which I developed in 2002, before the term workstation even existed. Back then my software is more based on a tracker. I guess it was inspired by Pro Tracker on Amiga, although it's got much finer resolution than the big blocks of time that uses. It means that all of the effects from sample playback and saw wave generation and filters and reverb algorithms, delays, chorus, flange, everything I've developed myself. I've had to work out how to do those things. I'm not a natural programmer or a mathematician, but I can learn how to do those things, so I have for this. And over 24 years or however long it's been constantly upgraded and improved. So that's how I actually created the album. It's still all recorded externally, traditionally, and then all those recordings are loaded into Prometheus for playback. One interesting new effect in Prometheus that other DAWs don't have, of course I've made lots of new effects that other software doesn't have. All of the reverbs, for example, are completely unique to Prometheus. There's no third-party plugin. There's no way you can ever duplicate the reverbs because you'd have to design them yourself. Even I would struggle to copy them now because I'd have to look at the code to find out how they all work. But one unique effect that in this album is called Zeitraum, which is an independent time-space stretcher for samples. It works a bit like an effect called oscillator synchronization, which applies to old analog synths. It's not so popular now on digital synths, even though it can be made. My Yamaha Mod X, or Modi X, some people pronounce it, can't really do that effect, even though my old Ensoniq ESQ1 could do that. But it independently stretches time and length of a sample in a strange, gargly, tinny, spacey way. And you can hear that effect in the Nick Drake track. If you listen to the main vocal of Nick Drake, you'll hear its echo stretched and distorted in strange ways, which sounds really interesting. And I wanted it to sound sort of druggy and foggy and lost and paint pictures in your mind, which is what I always aim to do with my music. Well, version 2 of The Myth of Sisyphus is out later this year in 2026, and I hope you like it when you listen.